Welcome to Communism in the World, the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation series dedicated to telling the true story of communist ideology, its history of political implementation, and the legacy of Marxist political economy. I'm Murray Bissett, Director of Academic Programs, and I'm pleased to be joined today by Dr. Bradley Murg, Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of International Relations at Paragon International University in Phnom Penh, Cambodia. Brad also holds positions as Director of Research at Future Forum, an independent think tank in Phnom Penh, Senior Visiting Research Fellow at the Cambodian Institute for Cooperation and Peace, and Distinguished Fellow at the Royal University of Law and Economics. His commentary has been published in the Nikkei Asian Review, South China Morning Post, and the Asia Times. And most recently, Brad published Cambodia 2040, a Foresighting Analysis, which is being published in 3 parts. During today's event, Communist Cambodia, Khmer Rouge rule, and the contemporary institutional legacies, Brad will teach us about this fascinating kingdom. We truly are privileged to have Brad here with us to share his extensive knowledge of the history and current status of Cambodia. Just a quick note on the run of show. Following his presentation, we will have a discussion with Brad drawing upon questions submitted by the audience. You can submit your questions for him throughout the event using the Q&A function that's at the bottom of your screen. Brad, welcome. It's great to see you. I know the audience is eager to learn about Cambodia, so I invite you to share your presentation.
Thank you very much, Murray. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me just switch over a little bit and share my screen so we can get into the PowerPoint and go from just an initial discussion for about half an hour, and then move into some time for Q&A. So when we think about communism in Cambodia, and just to have a little bit of background, because it becomes essential to really understand the development of the Khmer Rouge and the development of the Pol Pot regime, we need to go back quite far in Cambodian history. We need to go back to the Angkorian Empire, 802 to 1431, the superpower of Southeast Asia. It's generally the image that most people think of when they think of Cambodia, is this image that you're looking at right now. It's on the national flag, and Angkor holds a very, very, very deep place in Cambodian identity. But it's also an aspect that played very much into the subsequent development of the Khmer Rouge, their ideology, and the development of the party itself in terms of their understanding of Cambodian history. Because Cambodia went from being a power that controlled most of mainland Southeast Asia to ultimately a French protectorate, 1863. Here on the left, what we see is Cambodia essentially as it was when it essentially agreed to become part of the French Empire with the agreement with France. We can see the borders much, much smaller than they are today. The map on the right, we see Cambodia ultimately when it finally receives its independence from France in 1953, having recovered a significant amount of territory. Now, French colonial history is not the most popular aspect of the history of the country here in Cambodia. It's something of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, France was the country that somewhat ensured that Cambodia would not be entirely swallowed up by Vietnam and by Thailand. Yet at the same time, France in 1939 had published a document stating its long-term plan for Cambodia and Laos was the massive movement of Vietnamese citizens or Vietnamese population into the relatively sparsely populated territories of Laos and Cambodia. France further broadly governed Cambodia, utilizing Vietnamese civil servants, resulting in a very, very, very strong anti-Vietnamese sentiment that would play out during the Khmer Rouge period. Following France's period of colonial rule and the ultimate collapse of the French Empire at the end of World War II, what we see is the rise of Prince Sihanoukville, who ultimately would become the king of Cambodia following the Paris Peace Accords. He had been king and then subsequently the head of a democratically elected government. And he rules from 1953 until 1970. This period is broadly viewed as the golden age, as the ideal period of Cambodian history, where we see a high level of development, where we see urbanization in Phnom Penh. Phnom Penh is viewed as the Paris of the Middle East, and Sihanouk broadly adheres to what is understood to be at least an attempt at neutrality, an attempt at a neutralist or third way foreign policy. Although more recent research indicates and relatively well shows that the Sihanouk government was quite supportive of the North Vietnamese, and this resulted in a coup in 1970, supported by the United States, bringing to power Lon Nol, who ruled Cambodia from 1970 until 75. But this golden age is really quite necessary to understand, because if we're going to understand the genocide in Cambodia and what the Khmer Rouge really wrought, it's essential to understand what was destroyed, what was here before. And here we see Monavong Boulevard, the central street in Phnom Penh, in the late 50s, early 1960s, most likely. And we see the beginning of the classic pattern of post-war, post-colonial urbanization and industrialization. At the same time as this was going on, as we were seeing Phnom Penh develop, and we were seeing the move towards modernity in the old theoretical language, we were seeing a very, very large gap, a very, very large gap between the capital city and the rest of the country, where the city itself and the elites living within Phnom Penh very much adhered to a very Western style of life, very strongly influenced by French culture, by the French language, etc. Life in rural Cambodia more or less continued as it had done for hundreds of years, with a very high level of poverty, generally subsistence agriculture and farming. And it's this urban and rural gap that will play a very key element, or serve as a key role in the ultimate rise of the Khmer Rouge and the extreme radicalism that we'll note in their approach towards government when they come to power in 1975. Cambodia really, in terms of comparison, can only be placed with Albania and North Korea in terms of the sheer levels of extremes to which the Khmer Rouge regime went. It's the ultimate in a radical form of Maoism, which we'll get into in a little bit. But who were the Khmer Rouge? What was their ideology? What was their origin? It's important to recognize that Pol Pot was influenced heavily by two figures, very much influenced by the work of Joseph Stalin, also very much influenced by the work of Mao Zedong. During his time, essentially in rural areas, but sorry, skipping ahead a little bit. Before we get that, it's also important to know that Pol Pot and most of the elite of the Khmer Rouge were the Cambodian elite. They were from upper middle class and elite families. Pol Pot himself, originally named Saloth Sar, was educated at the Lycée Sisawat, the premier high school of the country, and ultimately he and several others, along with many other Cambodian elites at the time, were sent to Paris for university education, where they were exposed to the more radical strains of French communism and those ideas that were prominent at the time. There's a debate as to were they radicalized before or were they radicalized after the time in France. The answer is probably somewhere in between. At the same time, the Khmer Rouge developed very much within the context of the Vietnam War, and we do have to recognize this fact. We have to recognize that Cambodia was a casualty of that conflict. William Shawcross's famous book on Cambodia, titled Sideshow, looks at the implications of the Vietnam War and bombing and how it did serve to radicalize a significant portion of the population and the tragic results that occurred. At the same time, it's also vital to recognize that the Khmer Rouge were, and consistently through their rule and their rise, supported by the government of the People's Republic of China, with extensive military support and extensive technical support. I live here in Phnom Penh, about 1 block from the National Library, which was turned into a cafeteria for Chinese technical advisors during the Khmer Rouge period of rule. The Chinese were here in incredibly large numbers then, and as we'll talk about a little bit later, have returned in very similar numbers with certain effects, obviously not remotely at the level of the 1970s, but which are somewhat disconcerting to Cambodia today. In 1975, in April of 1975, the Khmer Rouge take full control over Cambodia. The city of Phnom Penh falls. We see the evacuation of the American embassy, before the evacuation of the embassy in Saigon. And this was not expected. It's very difficult to put into words how shocked people were by the outcome of the Civil War. It's noted by one journalist and one scholar that when the American government evacuated Cambodia in 1975, they offered several thousand Cambodian citizens who had worked with the embassy, who'd worked with US aid and other American agencies, the opportunity to evacuate, to be flown out of the country, and less than 200 took them up on that opportunity, as the former US Ambassador John Gunther Dean has noted. People expected that it was peace. They did not know much about the Khmer Rouge. The Khmer Rouge had purposely kept themselves quiet. And when the Khmer Rouge took over Phnom Penh, the first thing they did is evacuate the entire city. A city that had swelled to 2.5 million people with refugees, and told the entire population the Americans were about to bomb Phnom Penh, take 3 days worth of supplies for your own safety, and get out. What none of the folks in the photo on the upper left realized was that it wasn't going to be for 3 days, it was going to be for 4 years. That this wasn't a temporary measure. This was the beginning of probably the most radical and the most extreme experiment in communist totalitarianism that has ever been attempted. And the lower left is where we see what that life reality was for most people who were evacuated. And the entire population of Cambodia was movement into an essentially agrarian forced labor camps. This was the uniqueness of the Khmer Rouge, was avoiding a policy of anything resembling industrialization. It was the idealization of an agrarian peasant society that ultimately was viewed as the perfect good. That was viewed as, well, this is how society should operate. This is how things should basically work. And if you're not on board, well, you have to be eliminated. And we have seen the documents since then that show that the genocide, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, wasn't simply a question of, well, the rice harvest didn't work, but rather it was clearly organized and planned by the Khmer Rouge to eliminate those that it did not see as being consistent with its own radical Maoist ideology. The photo on the right, I've always thought, has been a relatively perfect encapsulation of Khmer Rouge communism. That is the former National Bank of Cambodia, which the Khmer Rouge blew up and destroyed. As they said, well, we don't need one. We've decided to eliminate all currency. We see other buildings in Phnom Penh from the pre-75 era that are gone. Almost all Christian churches were destroyed. The Catholic Cathedral of Phnom Penh was famously taken apart brick by brick. There's I believe, one Christian Catholic church that's left. It only survived because it was behind a seminary and no one knew the chapel was there. Today, it's still the main Catholic church here in Phnom Penh. The genocide from 75 to 79. This focused on what were termed the new people. These were urban, educated elites. Not entirely elite. It really came down to, were you someone who was not a peasant? Were you someone who was remotely well-educated? Were you someone who was lower middle class, working class, spoke French, spoke English, and the famous anecdote, someone who wore glasses, something that simple, was a reason to be executed or to be sent to a punishment camp. At the same time, there's been some debate over the use of the term genocide, but this has been broadly settled in the literature in recent years when we look not just at the deaths that occurred from overwork, from starvation, etc., but we also see the fact that the Khmer Rouge explicitly targeted groups that they saw as not part of the revolution, not part of building their utopian ideal society. The ethnic Chinese population, the community primarily from Guangdong, the Hakka population as well, the Chaozhou, saw hundreds of thousands of deaths. much higher than the mean level we saw among the broader Cambodian population. Virtually the entire Vietnamese population of Cambodia was wiped out. They had been told they were going to be deported to Vietnam, and instead they were executed. And little known among many foreigners is that Cambodia has had, for the last 500 years, a very significant Muslim population, the Cham, whose kingdom was taken over and is now located around Da Nang in Vietnam. When their kingdom was taken over by the Vietnamese, they fled to Cambodia. And the Cham were wiped out to the tune of about 76% of the population, explicitly targeted because as Muslims, they were viewed as fundamentally incompatible with the regime and its ideology. We also, of course, saw the mass murder of at least 50,000 Buddhist monks. We have records looking at even the first few days following the evacuation of Phnom Penh and the mass murder of Christian clergy who were evacuating and were quite noticeable because of their clerical clothing and were simply taken to one side of the road and executed. The total dead, the estimates do vary, but broadly speaking, 1.5 to 2 million people, or approximately 20% to 25% of the Cambodian population dies during this 4-year period. A simply remarkable figure that's really quite difficult to fathom, noting that it's entire families, it's entire communities that have no one left, that there is no legacy, there is no one to report their history because of the sheer thoroughness of this regime's policy of extermination of anyone they saw as a threat to the achievement of their communist utopia. Khmer Rouge oppression is most well commemorated and recognized here in the Tuol Sleng prison, which is photoed at the right, also known as S21. The Khmer Rouge engaged not just in the torture and murder of their opponents, but like so many other communist regimes, had a very strong sense of insecurity and massive numbers of internal purges. On the left, we see photos of some of the 20,000 people who went through this prison, this former elementary school in central Phnom Penh, again today a museum. And of those 20,000 people, only six survived. The possibility of getting out alive, more or less impossible. Once you were arrested, that was more or less it. The Khmer Rouge were remarkably thorough in their documentation, and thus photos survive, records survive, forced confessions survive. We also have records of Westerners who unfortunately were caught up or were captured by the Khmer Rouge who were murdered there as well. On the upper left, you can see the photos of the makeshift cells used for prisoners in this former school that today is preserved as a national monument to mourning the victims of the Khmer Rouge. One of the rather tragic ironies of this is so much of the prisoners in S21 in Tuol Sleng were individuals who were purged from within the Khmer Rouge apparatus, who were purged from the party ranks. We don't have as much of a full memorial to those who were simply your regular everyday folks who, just because of their sheer identity and existence, were deemed worthy of execution. The Khmer Rouge rule finally comes to an end. The Vietnamese invade on December 25th, 1978, following extensive Khmer Rouge attacks and the mass slaughter of Vietnamese villagers living along the Vietnamese-Cambodian border. Vietnam basically had enough, and Cambodia was not remotely prepared under the Pol Pot regime for dealing with battle-weary, very well-trained, very well-experienced soldiers. These are very likely many of the same individuals who fought the United States and the South Vietnamese military. And the South Vietnamese sweep across Cambodia quite rapidly, putting broadly an end to the Khmer Rouge regime in most of the country. However, the Khmer Rouge do maintain during this period from 1979 and quite longer, certain regions where they have control. Pol Pot continues to essentially rule himself along with his party cadres, small portions of the country in Pai Lin in the far west, near the Thai border, and in An Long Vang in the north. But this does put an end to the Pol Pot regime, but only to be replaced with Vietnamese occupation, something that is still a very, very fraught topic in Cambodia. And in my view, actually has had quite an enormous impact on the subsequent institutional development of Cambodia. When we think of Cambodia, oftentimes in political science, we think of it as just a simply post-conflict society. But in reality, it's more than that. The Vietnamese invasion and Vietnamese occupation with full Soviet support really did create and begin to create the parties, or the main, today still the main ruling party, the Cambodian People's Party, and many of the leadership of the puppet government that was established by the Vietnamese were former Khmer Rouge who had fled the Khmer Rouge purges to go work with the Vietnamese, and these become the leaders of the government that the Vietnamese established in the 1980s as, again, a puppet state and an ally of both Vietnam and the Soviet Union. So where do things go when all is said and done? Where does Cambodia's politics move? And here on the left, I've tried to give a relatively straightforward summary of the last 40 years or so of Cambodian politics. From 1979 to 1991, we have the People's Republic of Kampuchea, or the state of Cambodia, as it's later termed, when in 1989, the government abandons officially Marxist-Leninist ideology in an attempt to gain some degree of global sympathy, seeing which way the winds were blowing in terms of the Cold War. In 1991, which we're celebrating here in Phnom Penh this year, the anniversary of the Paris Peace Accords, which finally bring an end to the conflict. And we see the first real United Nations state building mission, the United Nations Transitional Authority in Cambodia, or UNTAC, which in hindsight is viewed as not exactly successful and having some relatively negative institutional legacies. And from 1993 to 1997, we see a coalition government between two parties, Phun Sin Pech, which was the royalist party led by Prince Norodom Ranariddh, and the Cambodian People's Party, which was the successor party to the group that ran the People's Republic of Kampuchea under Vietnam, led by today Prime Minister Hun Sen. In 1997, we saw a military coup whereby the CPP removed Phun Sin Pech as a coalition partner. And from 1997 till the present, the kingdom has been ruled as a constitutional monarchy. Today, officially, the head of state, His Majesty King Norodom Sihanoukville, who succeeded his late father, the King Father, His Majesty King Norodom Sihanoukville, who returned to the role of monarch after the Paris Peace Accords, after Cambodia regained its full independence from Vietnam. But more broadly today, Cambodia is generally conceptualized by most political scientists as something of a either fully authoritarian or what I think is more correct, a competitive authoritarian regime. And this is a term coined by Stephen Levitsky and Lucan Wei at Harvard, particularly looking at Russia, looking at regimes that do allow open space for media, there are elections, there is a functioning court system. There are spaces for political contestation, although it's fairly obvious who's going to remain in power. Cambodia is not Vietnam or Laos in the sense of being a full-on authoritarian state, yet at least. It does preserve those spaces of openness. Here we see the new recently built headquarters of the CPP here in Phnom Penh. It's a massive building and quite the landmark. I use it myself when I'm in a part of town I don't know and I'm in a tower, because you can really see it from so many parts of the city. The remnants of the Khmer Rouge. Pol Pot only dies in 1998. Here you can see him in his last days, one of his final interviews. And on the right is the place where his ashes were scattered in an area in the north of Cambodia called An Long Vang, where even today there are several thousand individuals who live there and are still ardent supporters of Pol Pot and ardent supporters of the Khmer Rouge. They're generally left to themselves, left to sort of organize their own community and adhere to their own worldview. They're generally viewed as harmless at this stage, but it is an interesting place to do field work and to interview. The last time I was there, and I was doing interviews in that community, it's still rather stunning to visit this particular location and hear people say how great a man Pol Pot was, that he was a Cambodian national hero, and why is this his grave site when there should be a statue 30 meters tall commemorating his achievements. That is still a view held by this small minority that remains. But Pol Pot does die in 1998, and this is pretty much what's left of the true believers of the Khmer Rouge. So where does Cambodia go today? What have been the other institutional legacies? And there's a few that are pretty straightforward. One is we can simply look at the demographics. And this is the population pyramid of Cambodia. And here you can see ages between around 42 to 45. You'll see an enormous drop in the population. That, of course, is of the number of individuals born during those years. That, of course, is the period of rule by the Khmer Rouge. We see today also that Cambodia is a very young country overall. And this has something of an impact in its political economy and its politics, as folks generally increasingly want to look towards the future, look towards what's next, and really move beyond the legacy of the genocide and try to build a new Cambodia. This is a genocide that is relatively recent, but as the country gets older and as the younger population grows, it does seek to move beyond and look to its future, to its own economic development and its own economic growth. And most people in their minds of Cambodia, they think of Angkor Wat or they think of Pol Pot. What they don't think about is the economic development that we've seen today, as Cambodia has shifted overwhelmingly to a free market economy, towards market-based policies. There are very few economic remnants of state socialism left. And thus, when we look at Phnom Penh today, this is what we see. This is light years away from state socialism and state planning. This is the market. This is Cambodia's economy, grounded in tourism, grounded in the garment industry, grounded in a growing industrial sector in multiple areas, which has seen significant growth, which has seen significant foreign investment, and has seen significant rises in living standards. Only 20 years ago, if you looked at that same skyline, you wouldn't have seen a building really more than 8 stories tall. And today we see just phenomenal amounts of growth and investment coming into the kingdom and into the country as a whole. Here we see, just to get an idea as to contemporary Cambodia, as it shifted to market-based policies, year-on-year growth at 7%. We've had a pretty small dip this year, but it's been significant because of COVID. 17% of Cambodia's economy is based on tourism. On the right, you'll see the mainstay of the kingdom's economy, which is, of course, garment workers. The garment export industry, trust me, someone watching this right now is wearing something made in Cambodia. There's over $5 billion a year of Cambodian garment exports to the United States, which are received tariff-free. Cambodia is part of the US GSP agreement for less developed countries, and thus Cambodia is able to export its garments to the US without tariffs. And that is a very, very important part of Cambodia's economy and a very important part of America's economic relations with Cambodia. At the same time, as we look at Cambodia today, and the reason that Cambodia generally gets attention in global affairs is because of its relationship with China, where it was the United States, the Europeans, Australia, Japan, very strongly Japan, who initially were the main investors and the main providers of aid. Today, overwhelmingly China. Foreign direct investment, overwhelmingly from China, and increasingly the majority of aid, the majority of loans come from Beijing. There is really almost no area of policy or governance in this country that is not in some way touched by China or influenced by China. And so one might ask, well, why do we care so much? Why does China care so much about this relatively small country of only 15.7 million people that is generally viewed here in Southeast Asia as the main locus of geopolitical contestation between the United States and China? Well, it's pretty simple. I'll actually skip ahead a little bit. Cambodia is a member of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN. And ASEAN operates in one particular way. ASEAN operates by consensus. The only way any decision is made in ASEAN is if every member agrees. And several members of ASEAN, the Philippines and Vietnam being the most clear, have very significant disputes with China over the South China Sea and the territorial claims there. Cambodia has regularly blocked discussion of those issues, has blocked movement forward of ASEAN as a community of 650 million people and one of the largest economic blocs in the world to negotiate with China collectively on the South China Sea. So we see in Cambodia a place where Chinese influence today is quite strong. Chinese influence is stronger here than any other country in Southeast Asia, although we have seen a similar pattern in Laos, and also we see with Myanmar with the most recent coup, elements of distinct Chinese support as China continues to build its impact here. But it's very difficult to sort of overstate the impacts of Chinese investment on Cambodia today. To scroll back just to the sort of final slide, this is the town of Sihanoukville in southern Cambodia, a major port, which has become something of a white elephant. On the left, you see Sihanoukville 10 years ago, beach town, relatively quiet. On the right, you see Sihanoukville today, the city that's supposed to be the new Shenzhen. What we ultimately saw was it became the home of 47 casinos and the home of a huge amount of online gambling, et cetera. It's a city that Cambodians used to go to on the weekends from Phnom Penh, go enjoy the beach, et cetera. Today, Cambodians don't really go to Sihanoukville. They've been priced out of it, and it's widely viewed as essentially more of a Chinese city than a Cambodian city. It shows in a real physical form China's expansionism in the region and its level of influence. So hopefully, and just because I'm just about out of time, I want to make sure we have ample time for Q&A. That's provided in a very brief half hour, a bit of history, the overview of the Khmer Rouge, how Cambodia has developed since that time, and the realities that we see today in Cambodia, and why Cambodia is increasingly going to be something in the news in the United States. US policy towards Cambodia, we're all very interested to see the approach that the Biden administration will take on policy to the kingdom. With that, I think I can turn it back over to Murray, and we can move into discussion.
Thank you, Brad, for an incredibly informative and just expansive presentation. I mean, you managed to cover all the way from, what was it, 804 up until today. I mean, so well over 1,000 years of coverage here. Before we turn to some of the questions that have been sent in, I want to remind our audience that they can submit questions using the Q&A function located at the bottom of the screen. Now, I usually like to kick off with a question directed towards our educators that are here with us. And so I think it's fair to say that, you know, your average American, and especially your average middle school or high school student, knows very little, if anything, about the Khmer Rouge, about Pol Pot, about the genocide in Cambodia, and even about Cambodia today. So what advice do you have for middle school and high school educators on how to broach this subject, or, you know, what's the entry point that you found to be most effective when you've been teaching about the subject?
I think the thing that strikes people the most is the understanding of unlike other communist revolutions, which at least had some periods of transition or tried to convince their citizens that, oh, things will be better, et cetera. Cambodia is really, in 1975, when the Khmer Rouge take over, is a light switch. It's people going from living urban, normal, middle working class lives to immediately being removed from their homes, and if they make it through initial checkpoints, essentially being sent to labor camps or being executed along the way. It's the sheer brutality of the regime that is really not comparable to anything else that we've seen in 20th century history or after. The sheer scale of it, and the fact that this sort of utopian vision, this extremism, was allowed to take place. that most academics in the West generally ignored it or were apologists for the Khmer Rouge and said this was going to be wonderful. But seeing someone's life change, thinking of yourself sitting at home one day and having lunch with your family, and yes, there's a war going on, and life in Phnom Penh was certainly in no way pleasant in 1975. But knowing that 3 days later, you're going to be 20 kilometers away and desperately hoping that you can somehow survive in a world that you've never lived in, that you had thought peace was coming, they had promised this, and no, it was a lie. It was simply a pretext. The plan was always to commit mass murder. The plan was always to commit genocide against those were deemed as a threat. At the same time, this is a relatively, perhaps I'm aging myself, I mean, I'm 42, but this is a relatively recent phenomenon. This is something that happened in living memory for a huge number of people. In the United States, we have a very significant Cambodian diaspora concentrated in Southern California, in Long Beach, and in Massachusetts, around the city of Lowell. And there's over 150, I think 180,000 Cambodian Americans, refugees who settled and prospered in the United States, and whose story really has been left out of most American curricula. We're familiar with Vietnam, but most people, unfortunately, still tend to ignore this and aren't really aware of the extremism of it and the fact that it was something that occurred in such a recent period.
So why was the Cambodian ideology so extreme? And I think a slightly related point, you mentioned that unlike other communist movements, the Khmer Rouge idealized agrarian peasant society and de-emphasized industrialization. What was the origin of that choice?
There's several competing approaches. The one I find the most compelling is we obviously have the direct influence on the leadership of the Khmer Rouge of their intensive reading of Stalin and of Mao. But at the same time, once they return from their education in France, where they imbibe this sort of radical Marxism even more, where they strongly encourage go back, fight colonialism, fight neo-imperialism, and build this new utopian society, is they end up essentially in rural areas in the northeast of the country, where they're able to gain control. And one of the arguments essentially goes that this is where Pol Pot said, this is the ideal. This is the perfect society. This is a truly Khmer society. And this is what we should be. We have to purge all foreign influence. We have to purge all modernity, et cetera. And communism, we think about it as, talking about building a utopian future of industry. And we always think of the Soviet images of heavy industry, et cetera. And that's one version of communism, yes. Another is what we saw in Cambodia, which was, no, it's going back to, literally, the term was year zero, returning back to an extreme agrarianism that these individuals experienced and said this was the way to go. This was it. They engaged large numbers of peasants who saw what was developing in the capital, felt left out, saw a very corrupt government in Cambodia as well on all sides before 1975, and wanted revenge at a certain level. And that vengeance came, and it came very, very, very quickly. And that's something that other regimes held off on for a little bit. Or in the case of China, we saw it with land reform very fast. In the case of Russia, to some degree, but we don't see the sheer scale and the immediate mass murder that the Khmer Rouge began literally within moments of taking control of any community.
Thank you. Can you describe a little more China's involvement in what happened from 1975 through 79? And maybe address why it is that they deny so vehemently that they had any role, and then somewhat related, what was the official U.S. relationship with Cambodia during that time, and was there an unofficial relationship?
So on the Chinese side, this sort of comes into the Sino-Soviet split. So following the death of Stalin, we see eventually by 1960, China and the USSR are no longer all on the same team of communism. They are generally mutually supportive of the Vietnamese Revolution. But in 1975, China becomes the primary patron of Cambodia. It provides technical assistance, it provides weapons, it provides huge numbers of technical advisors, and is fully aware of what's going on. Why? Because they're in the field. They see what is taking place. I have Cambodian friends who are of Chinese descent and who speak Chinese, and whose parents or grandparents had immigrated from China, and they recall speaking to Chinese advisors. One gentleman telling me, he would say, asking, "I'm Chinese, please help me." And no, we won't do anything. China's completely denied the fact that it was the main patron of Cambodia. And China bears additional responsibility because China didn't just give the aid for free. China charged Cambodia, and Cambodia paid. And Cambodia paid in rice exports. And those rice exports were rice that was needed to feed the population. It didn't. It was sent to Beijing to pay off the technical assistance that was provided by China. China didn't give gifts, China demanded payment. And that payment resulted in the starvation and deaths of hundreds of thousands of Cambodian people. And China simply does not want to recognize this fact. They've been pushed on it before, and they consistently say, well, we never intervene in internal affairs of any other country. We've never done that. It's not our issue. And that's an interesting line. But no one seriously believes it. The evidence is so overwhelming at this point. I don't think there's any serious historian or scholar that denies that at this stage. We get a very weird situation with the United States in the dynamics. It's sort of the perfect example of the extreme geopolitics of the Cold War, where following the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia in 1979, Vietnam, of course, being an ally of the Soviet Union, the Khmer Rouge government essentially maintains some degree of control of a small portion of the population and is supported by China, which at that point had become blocked with the United States against the USSR. So we see the Americans, the Europeans, and the Chinese all supporting essentially the rump government of the Khmer Rouge as the official government of Cambodia, in terms going so far as to ensure that they maintained Cambodia's seat at the United Nations. Because it was fundamentally a zero-sum game. Anything that could weaken the Soviet side was something that the US was in favor of. It's certainly not a shining point in US foreign policy, but it is a very much explained by the geopolitical dynamics and the fact that the Vietnamese occupation government was Soviet supported. And of course, America was still reeling from the effects of the Vietnam War.
Thank you. During your presentation, you mentioned labor camps and punishment camps. Could you tell us a little bit about the differences that existed for the people who were actually imprisoned in each, as well as the different kinds of people that ended up in each? Although I think pretty much everyone ends up in the labor camp for sure.
Everything is collectivized, and the population that had been rural previously, the population from the villages, the old people, they experience collectivization, but they're given something of barely of a privileged status. They're not marked out for extermination. Those that come from the city, those that come from Phnom Penh and from other urban areas, places such as Battambang or Siem Reap, other much smaller cities that were taken over earlier, are referred to as the new people. And these folks, we now know, they were marked out for elimination from the beginning. And many of these were moved out to ancestral villages or had evacuated Phnom Penh and found a place to settle, or were trucked to settle in particular locations where, their rations, what they would be given to eat, what they would be given to survive on was much less than the old people. This was a class-based genocide. There were still others who evacuated Phnom Penh who were identified, monks, students, professors, lawyers, doctors, who in some cases could be of some use, who were sent to locations with even harsher conditions. I have one colleague here in Phnom Penh who was a student at the Royal University of Law and Economics when the Khmer Rouge came to power, and when he was evacuating with everyone else, was immediately identified by someone at a border post who knew him, who was a Khmer Rouge supporter, and said he's a student at that university, and he's sent to a different camp. He miraculously survives the entire experience. but these are camps that are designed simply to work people to death. It's death through attrition of you work, you produce this much, but we're not going to give you enough food, and we know what's going to happen to you eventually. Although increasingly what we're seeing from the scholarship is that it's not just death by starvation, it's straight out execution. It's mass graves after mass grave after mass grave that's being uncovered, or that have been uncovered. And it's not just, oh, starved to death or illness, although that was a huge issue. It's open and clear execution of anyone who was not part of the idealized Khmer peasant utopia that the communist Khmer Rouge were attempting to build.
Thank you. Hollywood has taken at least 2 stabs at depicting these events. Earlier there was The Killing Fields, and then more recently Angelina Jolie's adaptation of First They Killed My Father. Have you seen these, and what's your opinion of them? And are they true to the history?
I've seen both. Absolutely, I've seen The Killing Fields quite a few times. It's I mean, the sort of legendary film of the country, the famous film with Dr. Hang S. Noor and Sam Waterston, and they do provide. I think that film does provide a fairly graphic and realistic understanding. First They Killed My Father now, which is available on Netflix. There is some debate about it here in Cambodia, that it provides something a little bit of a westernized or overly romanticized understanding of this. There have been questions about the author, and well, if you were this age, how could you remember this much? And there have been critiques from Cambodians. I do think, however, as a means for people to begin to grasp precisely what happened, both are solid films. However, Cambodia, as it moves forward, and I think one of the most exciting things about Cambodia now is Cambodians really saying, well, it's our turn to tell our own story more fully, not mediated through a Western approach. And although there's a lot of ambivalence of how to approach that history, I think we'll begin to see more forms of visual art, more forms of documentation of novels, et cetera, from Khmer authors that give us a much broader understanding of the realities of the period.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to being able to see some of those. Now, you mentioned earlier that Cambodia's government today is controlled by the Cambodia People's Party. And the history here is really interesting, because both the Cambodian People's Party and the Communist Party of Kampuchea, which was the Khmer Rouge, claimed to be successors of the Kampuchean People's Revolutionary Party. But 3 decades ago, as you mentioned, the Cambodian People's Party officially drops its commitment to state socialism and Marxism-Leninism and adopts free market economics and conservatism. So how would you characterize Cambodia's post-communist development?
It's been quite interesting. It's on the economic level, yes, Cambodia has been open for business. Cambodia has and continues to follow, guided by, you can't really throw a rock in Phnom Penh without hitting a UN or World Bank or ADB project or a Chinese funded aid project to build up the infrastructure and to rebuild the human capital. It's important to remember here, we're still in the process of rebuilding the educational system. This is a country that was left with, I think someone once said, 3 lawyers survived after the entirety of the Khmer Rouge. Most of the educated population, teachers, professors, were entirely murdered. So we're still rebuilding that system today, which remains a significant challenge. So when we look at the party and we look at sort of the ruling party, et cetera, on the economic front, it's been full steam ahead towards the standard sort of Asian model of growth. Let's move into exports. Let's start with garments and then gradually move up the ladder. Cambodia has moved into bicycle production, which has been great. We've seen significant growth in that area. So we do see a government that is very much open for business and open for a free market style economy, although with issues in terms of rule of law, economic freedom. Cambodia still does not have the greatest ranking in that area. It still needs some improvement. On the other side, we do see a regime that is, I think, again, best categorized as more post-Soviet. And when we look at how sort of the rollback of 1990s era, Francis Fukuyama, end of history, everyone's going to become a democracy. And Cambodia really was sort of the model case, the case everyone thought, and hundreds of millions of dollars were invested in to build liberal democracy here. It really only can be called a failure. And it's a failure on a lot of levels. And one aspect we do have to recognize, it's something of a failure, an element of hubris on the part of the West, thinking that we know how to build democracy. We know perfectly how to create this from scratch. It's this, ironically, the same sort of socialist style top-down planning thinking applied to state building, which we now know a complete failure. This hasn't worked here, it hasn't worked in other locations where it's been tried. So we're seeing today Cambodia and the parallels, again, with the former Soviet states, thinking in Central Asia, thinking Russia. I see Russia as being, as a Russia scholar as well, I see Russia as sort of the most sort of clear parallel in terms of certain elements of governance. And it's important to recognize that a large number of the folks who are in charge of many things today were trained in Russia. I'm often surprised how often I speak Russian in Phnom Penh. You wouldn't think Russian would be a language you'd normally use with local government officials, but many of the senior folks have their graduate degrees, were trained in Moscow, and that's an element of the country today.
Thank you. Has Cambodia made any progress in addressing the genocide from the perspective of truth and reconciliation?
We had, over the course of nearly, and it continues, a nearly 20-year period, the attempt to, the extraordinary chambers, the attempt by the United Nations, supported by many governments, to bring the surviving leadership of the Khmer Rouge to justice, to trial. This process dragged on for year after year after year. I believe we ultimately only saw 2 convictions of 2 upper-level officials. These are very elderly individuals. But broadly, in terms of any sort of broader truth and reconciliation, no, that simply hasn't happened. There's certainly not the political will for it. And as things move forward, things are somewhat mixed. There's quite a few number of older Cambodians who realize that they're getting older and that this period of history has not been fully and publicly discussed in certain ways, and that they would like a greater discussion. But at the same time, as I mentioned before, it's a very young country. And a lot of Cambodians, a lot of the younger Cambodians that I work with, simply want to view themselves as, we live in a normal country. We don't always want to be viewed as the genocide country, as the country where this insane, horrible thing happened. We'd like to just live normal lives like our counterparts in Thailand and Malaysia and Singapore. We're just another Southeast Asian state. So there's this very strong tension between dealing with history, which could open a very significant can of worms. We have to remember that we don't really know who did what to whom during what time. There's elements, but the city was rebuilt, people moved in. Today there's over, what, 2 to 3 million people here in Phnom Penh. If we start going full into, well, who did what, you might find out that the nice elderly gentleman who you buy your coffee from every morning did some relatively horrible things to you and your family. So it's a very challenging issue that, in my view, is today a question for Cambodians to decide themselves. I think the West has tried state building. The West has supported the extraordinary chambers and has shown that it's failed. That its model really hasn't worked. And it's up to Cambodia. It's really a question to, and that is where we look for the future of Cambodian development. I always mention as a university professor here, as a scholar here, any foreigner who's not thinking every day, how do I transition my job over to a Cambodian, is not doing what they're supposed to be doing. Cambodia also is really tragically sort of the classic mark of the aid and development industry gone completely wrong, of decades and decades of planning and investment, and not really seeing the results that are intended, and wondering why we have such a huge number of foreign NGO and development staff, and why this hasn't been transitioned after 30 years to local Cambodians.
Thank you. So kind of shifting to economics, you've mentioned that the garment manufacturing industry is probably the most significant, followed by tourism. Do we know where Cambodia sources most of its cotton?
Cambodia, China. Cambodia runs a significant trade deficit, particularly in this area. When a couple of years ago, and then it finally went into effect this past year, the European Union has a similar preference agreement with Cambodia called the EBA agreement, everything but arms, which means that Cambodia was authorized to export essentially $4 or $5 billion worth of garments to Europe every year. The Europeans pulled this, arguing, led by Sweden, that Cambodia's human rights record and sort of the European perspective on the rollback of democratization was sufficient to warrant the removal of EBA. This was removed, and it hasn't had as big of an effect as we expected. But China promised and said, oh, well, we'll buy all the garments, we'll be able to come in and save all of this. And that, of course, hasn't happened. But China is still a major seller of raw materials to Cambodia for that production. The US still maintains its GSP agreement and maintains imports from Cambodia. It's probably the main source of economic leverage that the US has over Cambodia, as the US is not really a major investor in the kingdom, much less than China, Japan, South Korea, other Southeast Asian states. But that is an issue that has become more fraught in recent months. In November, we saw a letter from members of the Massachusetts and California congressional delegations, basically stating that obviously the home to the majority of the Cambodian American population, saying that the US should remove GSP, that it should remove the preferences, an act of Congress should be passed, and that the US should follow the European Union in this area. And there's of course the trade-offs there. Is this going to actually have an impact on the government, or will it simply throw hundreds of thousands of primarily women, who are oftentimes the sole earner in their household, out of work? The US has shifted to some degree, and while not removing GSP, has begun to apply Magnitsky Act and other mechanisms to target members of the elite. But the GSP debate is something that we're all expecting Congress will be discussing over the next year or two as pressure ramps up a little bit on Cambodia as its relationship with China continues to grow ever closer.
Thank you. One final question. If you were teaching middle school and high school students about Pol Pot and about Cambodian history and about Cambodia today, what are the 3 points that you would try to emphasize and have them understand?
The first thing is that if we're trying, Cambodia is following the work of one of my favorite scholars, Martin Malia, who said that in his famous book, The Soviet Tragedy, that communism always ends the same way. That communism ends in mass murder. Communism ends in personality cult and dictatorship. That Cambodia is the sine qua non of what communism ends as. That's it. It's an extreme case, but it's the paradigmatic case of what communism is, of what state socialism ultimately will bring out. And today we have such a younger generation who are unaware of what communism is. Well, take a look at Cambodia, because there is no way to defend it. The folks who were even apologists in the 1970s and the 1980s for the Khmer Rouge have come back to the kingdom and have done apology tours saying, oh my God, I am so sorry what I said. I defended that regime and I got it completely wrong. There's no one upstanding. And here in Cambodia, we have a law now that it's illegal to basically defend the genocide. The second aspect is the challenges. I think Cambodia is a perfect example of what we don't know in political science and in social science. The need for a little bit more humility in the making of policy and in the idea of what development can do, the idea of what top-down planning can do, both in terms of the economy as well as the designing of a state. Because after 30 years of massive investment to build liberal democracy, that hasn't succeeded. And it requires us to take a step back and really think, what can the state do? And what can the state not do? What do we not know? And Cambodia is a wonderful example of that reality. The third is quite simply, it doesn't really relate to the history, et cetera, is I would also really strongly encourage folks just to learn about Cambodia beyond the genocide. beyond these events as a normal country, as a country that had hundreds and hundreds of years of history of Buddhism, of tradition, etc., of remarkable scholarship, remarkable dance, remarkable culture, and amazing language, and beginning to engage with Cambodia as a normal society. That it's not a place that should simply be stereotyped as, it's just the land of genocide, it's just the land of mass murder. That it is a place that is developing a very distinct, new, vibrant culture, rediscovering its history, I've been amazed to see how often I hear 1950s and 1960s Cambodian music these days. But to begin to sort of think of it just from a purely Southeast Asian studies or global perspective of what is this country beyond that one aspect. And I think that's just a key element as Americans, as we begin to engage with Cambodia on a level of cultural respect, of saying that, yes, we're not going to simply put you in this box, in this pyramid, but we do have to discuss it. We have to discuss it, but there's more to the country than this horrific legacy and this earlier period.
Thank you, Brad, for joining us and for your ongoing work to help everyone better understand the past and present, and looking forward to the future of Cambodia. I would invite all of our audience to join us for our upcoming conference on the CCP's forced organ harvesting, which will take place tomorrow, Wednesday, February 24th, beginning at 4 p.m. Eastern, where we'll be joined by Sir Jeffrey Nice, who led the prosecution of Slobodan Milosevic, the former president of Serbia, at the United Nations International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, as well as Ethan Gutman, a China Studies Research Fellow here at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation and co-founder of the International Coalition to End Transplant Abuse in China, as well as David Mattis, an international human rights lawyer, author, and researcher who has served the Canadian government in numerous positions, Dr. Wendy Rogers, Professor of Clinical Ethics at Macquarie University, Sydney, Dr. Sean Lin, the Communication Director for Falun Dafa Association here in Washington, D.C., and our own Christina Olney, Director of Government Relations, who leads our engagement with U.S. federal and state policymakers, embassies, and advocacy initiatives with our human rights allies. To learn more about that upcoming event, as well as our others, our curricular resources, our Witness Project episodes, our other professional development opportunities for teachers, and how you can support our work, please visit us at victimsofcommunism.org. You can also follow our work on Facebook and Twitter at VO Communism. For the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, I'm Murray Bassett. Thank you all again for attending, and have a great day.